Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Good evening. Thank you for joining us and giving us an hour of your time. Gracias a todos por acompañarnos esta tarde y brindarnos una hora de su tiempo. My name is Jesús Guzmán. I'm the Policy and Advocacy Director for Generation Housing. Mi nombre es Jesús Guzmán y soy el director de política y abogacía aquí con Generation Housing. This event is being simultaneously translated in Spanish. Este evento está siendo transmitido en vivo en español. To access that feature, click on the interpretation button at the bottom of your screen and click the Spanish option. Para acceder a este servicio, favor de oprimir el botón al fondo de su pantalla y seleccionar el botón para el español. We want to thank Gabriel Gutierrez, who is offering our audience live Spanish interpretation this evening. Y le damos las gracias a Gabriel Gutierrez, quien nos brinda la interpretación al español esta tarde. For this evening's webinar, we invite the audience to submit a question using the Q&A function also at the bottom of your screen. We encourage you to add a question or vote by liking others' questions so that we can make sure those that demonstrate the most interest from the audience are able to rise to the top. Now, up next, I'd like to introduce Jen Close, Executive Director of Generation Housing, who will be moderating this evening's discussion. Jen?
Thank you, Jesus. Before I introduce our panelists, I'd like to give everybody a brief introduction to Generation Housing. Generation Housing, or Gen H, is a new, independent, nonprofit organization created to advocate for more and more affordable homes in Sonoma County. Sonoma County had too few homes before the wildfires of 2017 and 2019. The scarcity and cost have driven away young families and made it hard to attract and spur new businesses. The proportion of people in Sonoma County who pay more than a third of their income for housing is the highest in the Bay Area, including San Francisco. These challenges existed before the current health crisis. Gen H advocates for housing, not just for its own sake, but because we know that ensuring safe, stable, and affordable housing for all is the strongest lever we can pull to improve individual economic opportunity and health and educational outcomes, and our community's environment and economy. The pandemic has made clear the link between housing and health, revealing how critical safe, stable, and affordable housing is. The virus and economic consequences from the necessary shelter-in-place order have shined a light on pre-existing inequities in housing, putting those who are unhoused or in unaffordable, overcrowded, unhealthy, or unsafe environments at even greater health risk. This is a weighty time for our leaders. While managing our health crisis, they also have to simultaneously pivot to economic recovery, part of which will have to involve keeping our community members in their homes and increasing the production of much-needed housing units, which can also serve as a powerful economic engine and job creator. So I want to express my gratitude collectively to all of our elected officials, some of whom are joining us here tonight. Thank you. Thank you for your service always and especially now. And I want to acknowledge the leadership of the panelists we have here tonight. A big part of leadership is being accessible and being willing to answer questions, especially when those questions are tough and the answers are unknown or sometimes unknowable. All of our panelists have been models of leadership in this regard, including their participation here tonight. We're fortunate to welcome Congressman Jared Huffman, Senator Mike McGuire, and Supervisor Linda Hopkins, who are here to bring us up to date on the federal, state, and local housing policy responses to COVID-19, as well as Ronit Rubinoff of Legal Aid of Sonoma County, who will talk to us at a practical level about the protections afforded to renters and homeowners facing eviction due to the pandemic. After our panelists have a chance to present, we'll have a question and answer period, starting with questions prepared by our staff and ending with yours. So I'd like to start and welcome and introduce Congressman Jared Huffman. Congressman Huffman represents California's 2nd Congressional District, which spans the north coast of the state, from the Golden Gate Bridge to the Oregon border, including Marin, Sonoma, Mendocino, Humboldt, Trinity, and Del Norte counties. He was first elected to Congress in 2012. Prior to serving in Congress, Jared represented the North Bay for 6 years in the California Assembly. Congressman Huffman will be sharing with us what the federal response has been to address housing issues during this pandemic and updates on what's on the horizon. Congressman.
Thank you, Jan. I appreciate that introduction. It's an honor to be with you and Jesus, and let me congratulate you and your colleagues for this important initiative. Also, I'm honored to join my colleagues, Mike McGuire and Linda Hopkins, who are great leaders on this and many other issues from their respective public service positions. So I want to tell you a little bit about what Congress has done so far in responding to the pandemic as it relates to housing. And before I get into some of those details, let me just say, I don't think we're done, and I'm not satisfied. I think we've got more work to do. But the big provisions come in a piece of legislation, about a $2 trillion piece of legislation passed about 4 weeks ago called the CARES Act. And it provides $4 billion. So let's start with homelessness and folks who are at risk of homelessness. The CARES Act dedicates $4 billion for emergency solutions grants. Now, this is an existing federal program, but it's been modified a little bit by the CARES Act so that it can be used for temporary emergency shelters, and there's no need for some of the habitability and environmental review protocols that normally go along with that funding. So this is money that can be used for emergency shelter, homelessness prevention. That includes short and medium-term rental assistance for people who are either homeless or at risk of homelessness. And another nice aspect of this is it includes support services, because we know it's not enough just to put a roof over people's heads. So moving to rental assistance. The key here is going to be whether we're talking about a covered dwelling, which is a legal term of art. And if you do have a property that qualifies, and if you're a renter, we're really talking about Section 8 tenants here, then there's a moratorium on evictions as well as on late fees for non-payment of rent and any other charges. That moratorium's for a period of 120 days, and it goes retroactively back to March 27th. So that's, I think, a helpful provision for renters if they're fortunate enough to have that federal connection, to have that federal rental assistance. And then moving over to homeowners, if you've got a federally backed mortgage, and there are a lot of mortgages do have federal backing. So this could be if they were purchased or securitized by Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac, if they are insured through the FHA, and that, by the way, includes reverse mortgages or home equity conversion mortgages, I'm told, at HECMs, another term of art, if they've got a mortgage that's guaranteed by the VA, or if they have a mortgage that is financed through the Department of Agriculture. USDA has some housing funds. Any of these things, or if it's one of HUD's Native American or Native Hawaiian, we're probably not dealing with that home loan guarantee programs. Any of those federal connections will get you the status of a federally backed mortgage, and there's some nice protections in the CARES Act. Homeowners get a foreclosure moratorium of at least 60 days. That also goes back retroactively to March 18th. And so no new foreclosures, and also the continuation of any foreclosures that had already been initiated at that time. And they're also provided with the right to request and receive a forbearance on their mortgage payments for up to 6 months, and an option to extend that for another 6 months. So we're talking about up to 1 year of mortgage forbearance. You do have to apply for that in advance, obviously, but that's a nice potential protection. And then finally, for rental property owners, there's also some protections under the CARES Act. If there's a federally backed mortgage and tenants are having difficulty making the payments, you've got a forbearance on foreclosure of up to 30 days, and that can be extended for up to 2 additional 30-day periods. So that is for, I guess, a total of 90 days where you could get some forbearance from your lender. And that is for multifamily units of 5 or more units. Very important that rental property owners reach out to their mortgage servicers if they need assistance on any of this, and also to find out whether their particular loan is federally backed. I'll just end with one last thing. We are hoping in one of these next waves of federal legislation to have a big infrastructure initiative. And some of that legislation is taking shape right now. Many of us are pushing to include housing in that. It's a little bit unresolved. Certainly it'll include transportation and clean water and broadband, I'm confident. But we also need to include housing and schools. And so just know that we're going to be pushing for that. And I hope to have something positive to report in the next couple of weeks. Thanks for including me.
Thank you for being here, Congressman. We appreciate it. I'd like to next welcome State Senator Mike McGuire. Since 2014, Senator McGuire has represented the beautiful North Coast in the State Senate, a district that stretches from the Golden Gate Bridge to the Oregon border. Mike is a third-generation Northern Californian who was raised by his mom and grandma in the Alexander Valley. He lives in Healdsburg with his wife, Erica, an elementary school principal, and their pug, Gertrude. Senator McGuire will share with us the state's response to address housing issues during this pandemic and updates about upcoming housing legislation. Senator?
Hey, well, good evening, Ms. Close. Thank you so much for hosting this important forum tonight. I want to say also thank you to Mr. Guzman as well. It is an honor to be with Congressman Huffman. I want to take a moment to acknowledge Congressman Huffman for his amazing advocacy on behalf of all of us in Washington, D.C. in these challenging times. Acknowledge Supervisor Hopkins for her fantastic work on behalf of the county and the North Bay, and of course to Ronit for everything that she has done and Legal Aid has done on behalf of tenants and homeowners during the fires and now through this pandemic. And it is wonderful to be with each and every one of you. Thank you so much. I'll be quick. I'd like to be able to go over where the state is heading with housing right now. I think that we can all agree the issue of affordable housing in particular is more important than ever. Before this crisis, California was facing a shortfall of approximately 1.5 million affordable rentals between the decade of 2015 and 2025. And what we know is that need for affordable housing has become even more acute during this pandemic. Before the coronavirus hit California, we were at our lowest home ownership rate since the 1970s. And if you take a look at the top 30 most expensive rental markets in the United States of America, the state of California is home to 20 of them. In this pandemic, I believe, and I think that we can all agree, has only become more of a spotlight on the challenges and inequities that exist in the state when it comes to housing. So what are we going to do about it? Number one, the state Senate is moving a robust housing production package forward this year in 2020. It's being led by the president of the Senate, Toni Atkins. I'm honored to be able to work with her and on this special committee to be able to move this legislation forward. It will be unveiled here in the coming weeks, and would like to be able to just quickly talk about some of the items that the Senate has been focusing on. Number one, can we look at redesigning or redeveloping mall sites or former mall sites, and how can we incentivize smart growth within those sites? How do we incentivize respectfully duplexes and triplexes? What can we do to make sure that we are including more inclusionary units throughout the state for affordable housing? We need to make sure that we are hyper-focused on preventing displacement and gentrification within our neighborhoods. And that's going to be a fine balance that we're going to be looking at. And then also, look, I'm not sure you heard, but state announced today, we're looking at about a $54 billion budget deficit over the next 18 to 24 months due to the coronavirus. But we have funding set aside dedicated for housing development. How can we expedite that money in a few billion dollars into the economy starting in 2021? Not only will it be good for those who are in search of housing, but it also will keep people working, and it will get people to work. So I think that's an important piece that we're looking at, is how can we move forward strategically on funding to be able to build as well as keep people working in these challenging times. We are anticipating anywhere between a 12 to a 16.8% unemployment rate by the end of this year. So it's critical that we keep people working and get people to work. Finally, on the issue of homelessness, I think that we can all agree it is a crisis in big cities and small across California. We have some of the highest homeless populations in the state, in our congressional and Senate district, and it's simply unacceptable. And that crisis is going to even grow. It's going to grow because of this pandemic. So the state has been moving a few $billions into the area of homelessness to be able to combat this crisis. Sonoma County, over the last 36 months, thanks to the leadership of Supervisor Hopkins and the Board of Supervisors, they've received countywide about $41 million from the state of California. And breaking it down, it's really focusing on how we can look at permanent supportive housing, especially for those who are dual diagnosis, mental health, as well as drug and alcohol addiction, and how do we prevent homelessness in the first place. And the Board of Supervisors in many cities have robust plans on how to be able to spend those dollars here locally. Just some examples of where the state money has gone. 22 million in the last 2 years have gone to about 11.6 million into the Caritas Village project that will eventually build 128 units, 10.5 million into 61 units for chronic homelessness, and about 12 million in 2019 for emergency homeless funding. I'm looking forward to the discussion here tonight. Know that we have a lot of work in front of us, and our work is more important than ever. And again, Ms. Close, thank you for hosting this critical forum, and look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Senator. Okay, next I'd like to welcome and introduce Sonoma County Supervisor Linda Hopkins. Linda was elected to serve the 5th District in 2016. Linda runs Foggy River Farm with her husband in Healdsburg, California. She earned a master's degree in environmental science communication and bachelor's degrees in both earth systems and creative writing from Stanford University. And she had a career in journalism before being elected to the board. Like many of her constituents right now, Linda and her husband are doing the tough job of managing their full-time jobs while managing the child care and education of their kids. Linda is going to talk about the steps the county has taken to address housing during this pandemic. Linda?
Thank you so much, Jen. One thing that I want to start off by acknowledging is actually how lucky and privileged I am to be in this position. Yes, it is challenging trying to raise and take care of the education of 3 children while also working full time. But at the end of the day, I still have a job. And I want to acknowledge that everyone on this panel has that privilege and is so fortunate and blessed to be able to continue to work. And unfortunately, that is not the case for so many young families in Sonoma County today. I want to share a little bit of a statistical analysis with you. I serve on the First 5 Commission, and we actually conducted a survey, and it wasn't every single family and every single parent in Sonoma County, but it was a few hundred, so it was a decent sample size. And among English-speaking parents, I want to share that 10% of them lost all income. So 1 in 10 families experienced a complete loss of income as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. 24% saw their income reduced, and 66% saw no change at all in their income. But when it came to Spanish-speaking families, those statistics were completely flipped. And so we actually saw 66% experience a reduction in their income, and actually 43% lost all of their income. So 4 families out of 10 have experienced a complete loss of income as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. It becomes so critical to make sure that these families and also people without children are stabilized in their housing throughout the course of this pandemic. And to that end, Sonoma County has stepped up with some tenant protection ordinances. Now, I think that it's a little bit complicated, and I'm hoping that Ronit will get into this a little bit more. We actually have multiple ordinances in place at different levels of government. And I actually think that's a good thing, because it actually shows that all levels of government are working very hard right now to align to protect tenants and make sure that they are not displaced from their homes in the midst of this pandemic. So the county got out ahead of things, and we passed a tenant protection ordinance, and then the governor issued an executive order, and then the Judicial Council issued a ruling, and then Sonoma County actually moved forward with strengthening our local tenant protection ordinance. And I believe that Ronit will be going into a little more of the policy details to ensure that everyone is aware of their current rights. And I also want you to know that on Tuesday, June 2nd, the Board of Supervisors will be considering strengthening our tenant protection ordinances. There are still some gaps in the Judicial Council ruling, and there are still some additional protections that I think that we could put in place to ensure that our tenants are stabilized during this time. I also want to give a huge shout out and send so much gratitude to both Senator McGuire and Congressman Huffman. We are very fortunate in Sonoma County to be moving forward aggressively with trying to get unsheltered residents into temporary shelter. And 2 of those avenues have involved a very close partnership with the state. We are currently leasing Sonoma State University to stand up our alternative care site. And this is actually providing shelter for high-risk unsheltered residents. So those who are at high risk of COVID-19 complications. And while homeless shelter is not something that is traditionally covered by FEMA or, sort of the federal government, we're extremely lucky that those unsheltered residents in our community who are at high risk for COVID-19 complications have been eligible for federal funding. And given the fact that our budget, while not quite as dire as the state's budget, is very, very stressed as a result of this COVID-19 pandemic, every dollar that we can gather from the federal and state government is really critical to our success. So I just want to say thank you so much, Congressman Huffman and Senator McGuire, for your advocacy on behalf of our unsheltered residents. And actually, I forgot to add one other thing, which was also a fantastic state partnership, which is that we also do have trailers currently installed at the fairgrounds, providing shelter to some of our formerly unsheltered residents. And that is a result of a partnership with the state as a result of, those trailers that were available for prior disasters. So there is so much work to be done. And I just want to call out the inequity that we're seeing with respect to the COVID-19 impacts. The fact that our Spanish-speaking community is being hit harder and that in some cases they are not eligible for federal relief as a result of their undocumented status means that we need to step up locally even more. And I'm proud to say that just last week, the Board of Supervisors approved $70,000 of relief for undocumented families being distributed through Latino service providers, UndocuFund, as well as River to Coast Children's Services. So it's not enough. The need far exceeds the resources, but we're going to keep pushing and trying to make sure that our tenants are safe and that we do have cash in people's pockets to be able to buy groceries and pay rent. And I'll hand it back to you, Jen.
Thank you, Linda. Next, I'd like to welcome and introduce Ronit Rubinoff. Ronit is the Executive Director of Legal Aid of Sonoma County. Ronit has been a public interest lawyer for over 25 years. Ronit, welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for the invitation to be part of this super important conversation. And to everyone on this call for their advocacy and work. Again, I think we all feel so grateful to work in this community where we have so much commitment and to this work. So just a little bit about, let's see, Jesus, you've got my PowerPoint up there, I think. There we go. Just a little background on Legal Aid of Sonoma County for starters. Our program provides free legal services to folks, and FYI, we do serve folks that are undocumented. We have no restrictions on who we help in that arena. Our programs include housing work, child abuse prevention, domestic violence, another hotspot right now, elder issues, and disaster relief ever since the 2017 fires. And what's interesting about that list of services is housing intertwines with all of them. We see the effects of the housing market and the rental market and all these issues throughout all the populations and programs that we touch. Next. In particular, Legal Aid's housing program focuses on tenants. We serve some low-income landlords, but mostly tenants. We serve over 600 tenants a year on a normal year. Stop for just a minute looking at COVID right now. Our housing line is experiencing volume 3 times that which we normally get. So if we were to extrapolate that, we would end up with serving, 1,800 tenants this year at that rate. We're bracing for a tsunami of need from the tenant population after the state of emergency is lifted, and so are my colleagues around the state, because our volume on all our call lines is reflecting that need building. Clients that we serve in our housing program include a large number of seniors. In fact, that's the #1 issue that our elder population comes to us about, our housing related problems. We see people with disabilities, communities of color, families, and immigrants. Our services include eviction defense, so kind of what we're talking about today's call, issues involving habitability, a big problem in this county, especially without proactive inspection programs. And we serve folks that are on Section 8 that Congressman Huffman referenced earlier. We also have a housing policy arm that where we're working on things like an eviction moratorium. Next. So before the crisis hit, we had about 40% of the households in the North Bay that rent their homes. And at that time, pre-COVID, about 50% of those households paid more than 1/3 of their income in rent. We are hearing now that after COVID, we could expect to see as many as 24,000 renters in Sonoma County. paying over 70% of their income towards rent, given the loss in income and everything that's going on. So we're bracing for a hit. And what was discussed before about the housing climate in this county makes, I think, Sonoma County particularly vulnerable in the state to the COVID impacts. Let's see, some of the things we've been working on are policy protections. We have a housing team on call 5 days a week to answer calls and to help folks with their legal issues. And we've been developing some FAQs for tenants that are available, by the way, on our website if anybody out there is listening and wants to pick up those FAQs. Next. So in terms of the current law right now, Linda mentioned, Supervisor Hopkins mentioned that we've had all these different laws kind of coming into place at different times from different jurisdictions, and it got a little bit confusing for folks. Really, the controlling law right now comes from the Judicial Council rules, those emergency rules that were enacted. Those are wide sweeping rules that affect lots of areas of practice, but in particular around housing. What happens right now is that the courts in California, any court, cannot issue a summons in an eviction case until 90 days after the state of emergency is lifted. That could change. You know, the Judicial Council could modify that, but currently that's where the law stands. So for example, let's say June 1st, the state of emergency is lifted. It would have to be 3 months after that before a summons could issue and a tenant could even be served with a complaint. But come 90 days, without any other protections in place, every single tenant who's been fallen behind on their rent until then is subject to an eviction. So it's forestalling the inevitable. It's good that we have it frozen in place right now, but once that 90 days rolls out, every person who is who's fallen behind on the rent could be evicted. And the eviction process in this county, in Sonoma County, happens pretty rapidly in about 3 weeks. The other thing that's forestalled is if a landlord has already filed an unlawful detainer complaint with the court, a tenant is not going to be held responsible for answering that complaint until after the courts reopen. So if there are folks out there who might have received paperwork from the court before this hit but didn't have a chance to answer or respond, you do not have to worry about that case until after the court opens and you get a new hearing date. The good thing about the Judicial Council rule and what makes it most wide sweeping is that it covers all evictions. So the local ordinance, when it was enacted, only covered certain kinds of cases. The Judicial Council rule covers any kind of eviction. So again, it's 90 days and it's all evictions. The only exception, and we see this exception throughout the law right now, is for matters of public health and safety. So, you know, let's say there was a fire in a building and it became uninhabitable for some reason. The tenants could be asked to leave under those circumstances. Other than that sort of thing, though, these cases are frozen. Okay, one note on that. If you are a tenant, you may still receive a notice of termination of tenancy from your landlord. That notice could say you have 3 days to pay or quit, pay the rent or quit the property. The landlord still has the right to give you that notice, but there can be no further legal action taken on that notice again until after that 90-day period. But you may still get a notice from your landlord, a 30-day, a 60-day, a 90-day, or a termination of tenancy for non-payment of rent. Next. Next. Okay, we think that there needs to be some significant additional protections for tenants to avoid having a tsunami hit us when that 90 days rolls out. So like I said, 3 months after the emergency orders are lifted, if there's no further protections enacted on a local or state level, every single tenant who has not been paying the rent could be subject to an eviction. That is thousands and thousands of people in this county alone. So we would like to see a provision passed that, similar to one that is passed in several other jurisdictions, is under consideration throughout the state. We'd love to see the state take this action, but at a minimum to see the County of Sonoma take an action that would prohibit evictions based on non-payment of rent when that rent accrued during the shutdown, during the shelter-in-place orders. So this would not impact rent that was paid accumulated previously, but if you didn't pay your rent during this COVID period, you cannot be subject to eviction going forward for that non-payment. Does that mean you don't owe the money? No, it doesn't. The landlord still has a right to collect it from you. He can go to small claims court or take some other civil action to collect that rent from you. You still owe the money. But what we're saying is we would like to see a rule that says you can't lose your housing because you didn't pay it. We also think that we should have a limit on any rent increases during this time period. And finally, we should see late fees eliminated during this time period. That only exacerbates the problem. The reason that we think this is fair for landlords, let me just say that, is if you're a landlord and you evict your tenant right now for non-payment when that 90 days lifts, you're not going to see that money. We know that the collection rates for post-judgment relief is very, very, very small. And if a tenant is still in your property and you still have a relationship with that tenant, there's a much greater likelihood that you're going to be able to collect that back rent at some point. If you evict that tenant, chances are you're never going to see that money anyway. The other reason we think this is super important, other than stabilizing everybody's housing, is because our entire economy is based on these folks having stable housing. So all the sectors that are most impacted by COVID right now have the largest number of employees that are renters. If I'm trying to start my business over again and half of my workforce is losing their housing, how am I going to bring them back to work? This is just going to make the rollout impossible. So this is going to ripple out throughout our community, not just affect the tenants themselves. Okay, next. Super quickly, main things tenants should know. You are still required to pay the rent if you can. Nobody can force you to vacate your unit except the sheriff. By the way, that includes if somebody's trying to inspect your unit for anything other than emergency health or safety reason, you do not have to let them onto your property. You're not required to enter into any kind of payment plan in order to halt the rent payments right now or to protect yourself from eviction. We advise people to collect documentation about why they can't pay the rent. I think that could be helpful in the long run, but you're not required to produce that documentation in order to be protected from eviction right now. And again, you're protected currently under the state of the law for 3 months after the state of emergency is lifted. Okay, next. Some housing resources. I'm sure this will be shared and available to people after, but just a list of our partners in the community that are providing rental assistance, shelter, resources that directly impact people's housing. Wanted to put that list out there and those numbers, and we'll have that available, I'm sure, after the seminar. Next. Next. Thanks. Thanks for your help, Jesus. If you need help, just a reminder, Legal Aid's housing hotline available 5 days a week during business hours. If you leave a message, we will call you back. And of course, services are available in Spanish. That's 843-4432. Please call us if you have any questions at all about your rental situation, and don't sign anything until you talk to us. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Renee, for all that good information and for all the work that you and Legal Aid do. I know you're always stepping up every time there's a crisis, because the crisis always ends up being a housing crisis. So thank you. So we have about 25 minutes for questions, and we'll start with some of ours, and then we do have some good questions coming up in the Q&A box. So then we'll turn to the audience questions. And I will start with a question for Congressman Huffman. U.S. Representative Ilhan Omar recently introduced H.R. 615, the Rent and Mortgage Cancellation Act of 2020. Congressman, can you talk about where the legislation is at the moment? Just talk about the legislation a little bit.
Yeah. So my friend Ilhan Omar is thinking big, as we need to in a moment like this. And so she has a bill with a couple dozen co-sponsors that would create a very broad payment cancellation program for all rent payments, as well as all primary residential mortgage payments. And it would last for the duration of the current national emergency declaration. So as long as we're in the COVID crisis, it basically would create a safe harbor for both renters and folks with mortgages. And the federal government would essentially backfill all of these costs. There would be a condition associated with that, and that is a set of fair renting and lending practices that would apply for a period of 5 years. So she would essentially bootstrap some new federal law into every mortgage and every landlord-tenant situation. And you know, I give her a lot of kudos for thinking big about the reality that this is going to just hammer a lot of renters and a lot of homeowners. The reason I'm not convinced that this is the right approach is that it applies to everyone, whether they need it or not. And I think we've got to be a little more targeted based on need here. And I'm a little nervous of the overreach aspect, kind of putting federal law into every landlord-tenant situation, into every mortgage, even beyond the basic civil rights type of federal backstops that we have. So I think it's probably a bridge too far to become law, but I like the ideals that it reflects. And I want to think big too. So I am, for example, on a letter with several of my colleagues asking for $100 billion, that's a billion with a B, for emergency rental assistance. And I think we can find a way to push something in that order of magnitude out in a way that gets to the folks who need it. That would be my preference, rather than just a blanket federal support for all mortgages and all rental relationships. Hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Congressman. It does. I understand that the city of Santa Rosa is bringing a rental assistance program to the council on, I believe it's May 19th. It's going to be around $600,000 for people affected by COVID that have fallen below 60% AMI. It is federal money though, and so it would not provide any relief to folks who are undocumented. If there's someone in the household who is documented, then it would be a prorated amount, but that would be a whole. And Supervisor Hopkins, you talked about this a little bit, but certainly we've seen that the undocumented generally are a vulnerable population, an important population in our community. And can any of you talk a little bit about what's in the works to better serve our undocumented community?
I would say that some of the protections that we and other advocates around the state are seeking from a legal perspective do not have any limitations. Don't restrict that protection to folks that are documented. And so if we can approach this from a systemic policy perspective like that, that's a way to protect everybody going forward, versus fiscal resources, which tend to be a little bit harder to meter out that way.
And I'll just add, Ronit's right in regards to, I think it's hard to meter out, and I think that the fiscal resources are limited. As you all know, the state has allocated 50 of the 75 million for those who are undocumented for emergency financial relief. Let's just be candid. It's simply not enough. It provides $500 per individual, $1,000 per family. Look, Congressman Huffman will be able to speak to this. He has been a champion for all, no matter your status or not. But I think that we currently have an administration in Washington, D.C. who wants to scapegoat immigrants, those who are undocumented. And what we believe here in California is that the diversity is who we are. It makes our communities strong and our economy thrive. But unfortunately, this 75 million, while it is a good start, simply can't be the end. And I think that's something that the state is also looking at, is how we can assist those who are undocumented, millions, by the way, who are taxpayers, I might add, law-abiding taxpayers who are paying into the system and should be receiving the services that all of us receive as well.
Thank you, Senator.
This is Linda. I just wanted to jump in and say that I think that knowing that we lack the resources that are adequate on any particular level of government, the more that we can stack resources, the better off we'll be, right? So you sort of see the state stepping up, and then can local governments potentially step up? We also have some absolutely fantastic nonprofit organizations. I know that Legal Aid does a tremendous service with respect to attempting to stabilize people in their housing. We also have UndocuFund, we have Latino service providers, we have Corazon in Healdsburg, we have La Luz in the Valley, we have West County Community Services and River to Coast Children's Services out in West County. And so I really firmly believe that we need to step up as a community and encourage folks. I mean, I've actually had a number of requests from people who say, you know what, I'm getting a stimulus check, but I actually don't need it, and I would like to donate it to someone who does. And so those are wonderful organizations that can get money directly into the hands of our undocumented community members. And so I think that the more that we try to encourage community giving, we do have some people in this community who can still afford to give. And so I think we need to focus on stepping up the generosity and seeing if there are other, couch corners that we can look under in local government. I know it's a challenging time, but if we can find any funding that we can get to those organizations, every family, counts. And just the outpouring of gratitude that I've already received from some of these small funds just going out people didn't think that they would have the opportunity to receive this funding. And so they're really humbled, they're really grateful, and they need more help. And there are more people, lined up who don't yet have that assistance. So I think we should all be turning our own pockets inside out, both governmentally and personally.
Thank you, Supervisor. Thank you, everybody, for weighing in on that important issue. So one more question from our end. As missed rent and mortgage payments mount, some are already predicting a significant rise in home foreclosures, as well as a bonanza in sales of multifamily rentals. While we've been sheltering in place and working to support the health of our communities, opportunistic private equity firms are raising funds to the tune of $1.5 trillion globally, ready for a shopping spree when property owners are pressed to sell homes and apartment buildings. What sort of measures can we put in place to ensure homeowners are able to stay in their homes and that the most vulnerable tenants are not displaced through a large sell-off of homes and apartment buildings?
Well, I'll jump in from the federal side of that, Jen, and I will say that even though I think we've provided some important eviction protection and foreclosure protection, there's nothing that I'm aware of in any of the actions Congress has taken so far that would address especially for the vacant and abandoned properties that these opportunistic venture capitalists might want to swoop in and snatch up. There's nothing that would prevent that at this point. So it's something that if folks are concerned about that, we're going to have to look at that a little bit further. But in terms of preventing foreclosures and evictions, I think we've started to provide some really important resources and protections. We've got a little more to do there, but that's what we've done.
Thank you, Congressman.
One comment about that, just based on our track record in terms of these properties turning over, one of the things that we see makes these properties more vulnerable to these predatory practices is when they're not being maintained. And so I think if we had strong rental inspection programs in this community, that would help forestall not only the decay of the existing housing stock we have, but it prevents some of these opportunities from occurring in the first place. So just a little side note on that, some long-term action is needed.
I'll just add on this is that, look, I think what we saw in the previous recession is these large equity firms swooped in, purchased what were previously owner-occupied homes, there we go, owner-occupied homes, and then turned them into investments and turned them into rentals. What I would hope, and it's thanks to the voters this past June, voters in California passed a $4 billion affordable housing bond. $1 billion is going to have to go to veterans housing. The remainder will go to low, very low, as well as moderate housing. I think we need to be able to get that money out sooner rather than later. Look, the bottom line is this: California is going to have some additional resources to be able to put into the community, into the hands of counties and cities to be able to build housing when we need it most in the depths of the recession. So what I would hope, and I think that you will see from the state, is a collective, innovative effort to be able to move dollars that were previously allocated, whether it's by the legislature or by voters, and get that moved as soon as possible, circulating in the economy to be able to do good. If the state has the ability to be able to compete with some of these equity firms, whether it's, and I'm making this up right now, whether it's going after properties like old hotels or hotels that potentially can't make it through the recession, or looking at strip malls, for example, that may not be able to weather the recession because they're over leveraged, using the public's money to be able to do good and to be able to tackle one of the greatest crises that we have in our generation, and that is the issue of affordable housing. More to come on that. I know I'm being squishy, but I think that you're going to see more definition here in the months to come.
Thank you, Senator. Okay, we're going to go to the audience questions. There are some really good ones, and I'll start with the ones that have been liked to the top. The first one's from Allie Gaylord. What lessons learned from the 2008 housing and foreclosure crisis can we implement today? ARRA, I believe that's the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, to shore up low-income housing tax credits, the neighborhood stabilization program revamp in order to keep people in their homes and head off investor purchases of foreclosures. I think this is to you, Congressman.
Well, one lesson that I hope would have transferred from 2008 to this crisis is that we would have robust oversight of these huge amounts of federal money that we're pushing out the door. And so we literally imported in many of the oversight provisions from that era, thinking that, you know, that was the sort of off-the-shelf bipartisan framework for oversight and accountability. What we didn't factor in was President Trump, and the fact that it literally in his signing statement, he was saying he's not going to honor these oversight mechanisms. He dismissed an inspector general that was a critical piece of us being able to make sure these dollars are going to the right place. And so we're in a different time. We should learn as many lessons from that most recent financial crisis as possible, but we have an administration right now that is fairly lawless, and we are going to be hard pressed to hold them accountable, and we're going to need to all be part of that. Some of you are associated with groups that are lawyered up and ready to go to court when necessary. We're going to need some of that. I'm going to need to get Congress back on the field so that we can do our job of pushing back and oversight. But it is going to be a challenge to make sure that these massive amounts of taxpayer funding actually go to the right place.
Thank you, Congressman. The next question is a long one. I'm going to try to summarize it. But what's the realistic, pragmatic plan to address months of back rent due? And the concern is that even if, you know, eviction is forestalled, that once someone has a huge amount of debt, that they're not going to be able to get their heads above water, and that homelessness will skyrocket.
I could take this one, and or Ronit, feel free to be able to lead us off if you'd like to, but go right ahead, and then I'll chime in.
Just two seconds. I mean, I think that's what we were describing before, that I think that the key policy move that we need around the state here is to convert that debt into consumer debt and remove it as a basis for eviction. I mean, the reason that's so compelling right now is because we don't want people losing their housing. So if we have resources to back up and pay off that rent for people, all the better. But if we don't want that back due rent being the reason someone's going to lose their housing. So if it gets converted into consumer debt, then at some point the landlord and tenant can work out a payment plan in the very, you know, future or not, but it's not going to result in an eviction.
What I'll just add in that is that, look, nonprofit affordable housing developers and nonprofit housing managers are asking the state to be able to come up with $1 billion to be able to fund back rent at this point. It's part of the budget discussion right now, just being candid about it. We've gone from a $21 billion rainy day fund to about a $17 billion rainy day fund, looking at 54 to 60 billion in the whole between now and the next 24 months. It's going to be a discussion about what we absolutely need to be able to fund. And there are going to be, I'm just going to be honest about this, there are going to be a lot of competing really good issues that are going to be in front of the legislature, but it is something that's being discussed right now, especially for affordable housing, nonprofit affordable housing organizations who are going to be facing a significant cliff with folks who are going to be unable to pay their rent and no money here in the near future. So that's one of the options that we're looking at. A formal request has come into the state, and it is being evaluated by both the Senate and the Assembly budget committees, even as we speak.
Thank you both for your answers. I think the corollary to the question of the tenants' debt is then what steps can be taken to support landlords to maintain their property without receiving rental payments. Senator, you just talked about affordable housing developers. They are just as at risk as for-profit developers, as well as mom and pop landlords. Can we talk about that?
Gladly. Again, I don't want to be a wet blanket in this conversation here tonight, right? But I think that on the issue of finances at the state, we could talk about policy and we can talk about budget. I think and again, just always want to be transparent and candid. The challenge that the state is going to face right now is there's only a finite amount of money that we're going to have in the rainy day fund to be able to spend on issues that are in front of us. So right now, what we're looking at is on the affordable housing side, those who are most vulnerable, especially in the very low and low income categories, who are most at risk, being honest about it, for homelessness. And if we take a look at who is most at risk for homelessness prior to the coronavirus hitting, it was women over the age of 60 and women with kids. And I believe that this is become even more acute during the virus. So with the 17 billion we have left, and I'm a firm believer that we're probably going to be in this recession through at least early 2022, peaking here by the end of this year, first of 2021. We can't spend that 17 billion all at once. And we are going to have to make, unfortunately, budget reductions that are going to impact the safety net. And so that is the discussion that this legislature is going to have is one of the issues is this $1 billion request to be able to help tens of thousands of low-income Californians who are unable to pay their rent. I also know that there are thousands upon thousands more who are in market rate rental situations that are in that same boat. But I just want to answer it candidly that I think at this point, the state will be focused on the most vulnerable who are in the very low and low income categories.
Thank you, Senator. And Supervisor Hopkins got booted off with that iffy West County Wi-Fi, but I think she's back on. And so I'm going to direct this question to all of you, but I know this is an issue near and dear to her heart is what about dollars for community land trusts so we can build and steward more permanently affordable housing that keeps families connected over generations in our communities?
I think that this is a fantastic opportunity that we have in Sonoma County, and we actually have multiple community housing and land trusts operating here locally. And basically what it does is it stabilizes the real estate market. You'll have, a nonprofit organization come in and actually purchase land and either build homes or actually buy the homes as well. And then they become permanently affordable because someone essentially is more of a long-term lease, but with an opportunity for equity. But when you actually, so you buy the home, but when you actually sell it, you don't sort of get all of the profit, right? You get sort of a percentage of the equity growth over time. And so it allows us to, basically slow down the crazy vagaries that we see in the real estate market locally. Actually, despite the current pandemic that we're facing, we are seeing bidding wars currently for houses in Sonoma County. And there's some, consideration that people are thinking that a lot of folks who are currently in the city are looking to move to a more rural area for the duration of the pandemic. And so unfortunately, we're actually not seeing a real slowdown in terms of housing prices locally. And community land and housing trusts are one way of combating that and essentially stabilizing that market, creating permanently affordable housing, and also still allowing folks, it's not like you're just paying rent and it evaporates each month. You're actually making that investment. And so you can get a return on that investment, a modest return on that investment if you do choose to sell.
Thank you, Supervisor. Our next question is from Davin Cardenas. Representative Omar's legislation blanket approach would make it easier to cover undocumented people as well as those citizens who live under different circumstances. Would Representative Huffman's proposal reach these communities as well?
Well, that's a great point. When you do just sort of take over all rental and mortgage obligations in a massive blanket program, you can do that, and that's one benefit of it. I still think that it's unlikely to happen. It's just too big. It's too ambitious. But yeah, of course I want to cover. I think this is a situation where, both in terms of the housing crisis and the healthcare needs during this pandemic, immigration status just shouldn't even be a consideration. But the politics of this. And so I'm probably have my work cut out for me to make sure that whatever we do on housing applies equally regardless of immigration status.
Thank you. I think we're going to ask one more question. Although this is a tough one, but you can do your best to do it quickly. Given the many economic and social returns of goods, sufficient housing, how can we use smarter financing strategies to help pay for it, to obtain those returns?
I'm sorry, who was that for, Jen?
Anybody who's got a good answer for this.
Yeah.
I could take a stab at it. I think that, look, I think what we need to be able to do as a state, and I can just speak for myself, is find unique ways to be able to get money moving in this economy. There's a really good chance that we're going to see a higher unemployment rate than we did during the Great Recession. of 2009, 2010, coming up over the next 12 to 20 months. So number one, we need to be able to expedite the bond funding that voters passed this past June. Number two, are there any sustainable revenue sources in the hundreds of millions on an annual basis that we could potentially bond against to be able to get money moving into the economy? And I'm making this up right now, but if we're looking for innovative solutions. So the way we moved the No Place Like Home initiative, which was $2 billion for permanent supportive housing for homeless residents, is we took 7% of Prop 63, which was the Mental Health Services Act, which generates on a bad year, $5.5 billion, on a good year, about $7 to $8 billion. We bonded against that 7%, and we generated $2 billion, which is now being moved into counties, $1 billion so far, to be able to build that permanent supportive housing. I believe that there are other revenue sources within the state budget that's not general fund that we could potentially do the same, which would be able to do good with that public money that we talked about. Re-envisioning malls, for example, strip malls, hotels. How can we, rather than the equity firms coming in like vultures and swooping up these properties, what can the state do to do good to be able to build housing, keep housing, and or assist cities and counties to be able to hit the RHNA goals? And I think that needs to be one of our goals as a state. And we're going to be one of the few that have that liquidity of dollars in this recession that are non-general fund. So that's just some early thoughts. And again, know that they're squishy, but expect some firm proposals coming up.
And if I can just add, I think that we would be remiss without acknowledging the leadership of Michelle Whitman, who is the executive director of the Renewal Enterprise District. And this was actually authorized by the state of California. So thank you, State Senator McGuire, for the legislation that was passed that allowed us, the county, to enter into partnership with the city of Santa Rosa with the goal of stacking all of those potential funding sources and warehousing them and making them easier to access for affordable housing developers. It's also going to be looking at how we can streamline permitting processes. To the senator's point before, we may be a little bit broke at this point in government, but we still have the opportunity to move forward policies. How can we pass policies that actually makes it sort of easier and cheaper to build affordable housing? Those are the kinds of conversations that we can have both at a local level as well as the state level. If people can enter into the process knowing that they will have a more certain outcome and a shorter length of time that they are spending in the planning process and the permitting process, then they might actually be able to achieve affordable housing even without additional subsidies.
Thank you. Thanks, both of you, for those good answers to the hard question. So it's time to wrap up. Thank you all for being here tonight, for your great answers, taking the time. This webinar is part of a series of events Generation Housing is hosting in May. It's part of Affordable Housing Month, the time of year to educate and inform the public about the work happening around affordable housing. This means engaging all of you to talk about what's working, what's still needed, and how we're going to get there. Please visit our website to learn about our other events coming up, generationhousing.org. We thank all of you who have already joined Generation Housing as members since our launch. And if you or your organization would like to join our efforts to increase the supply, diversity, or affordability of housing in Sonoma County, please visit our website to join Gen H. We are Gen H, and we envision vibrant communities where everyone has a place to call home and can contribute to an equitable, healthy, and resilient Sonoma County. And even during this dire time, we absolutely believe that together we can find solutions to our housing challenges. We want to thank all of our panelists again and thank everybody for joining us. We hope this has been an informative experience for you. Thank you and have a great evening.
Thanks.